Today's program is scheduled to last up to 60 minutes and includes time for questions and answers. Please note that this session is being recorded and all participant lines will be muted during the session. For technical assistance, please send an email to bu@compartners.com or send a message in the chat box. You may submit a question at any time by typing it into the chat box in the lower left corner of the window. Then be sure to click on the send button located next to the box. Today's program will also feature polling questions. When a poll is displayed, simply check the box next to the answer of your choice. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Maren McKenna. Maren McKenna is an independent journalist who specializes in public health, global health, and food policy. She is a columnist for Wired Ideas section, a senior fellow at the Schuster Institute for Investigative Journalism at Brandeis University, and the author of the 2017 bestseller, Big Chicken, The Incredible Story of How Antibiotics Created Modern Agriculture and Changed the Way the World Eats, which received the 2018 Science and Society Award and was named a Best Book of 2017 by Amazon, Smithsonian, Science News, Wired, Civil Eats, and other publications. She writes for the New York Times Magazine, National Geographic, Mother Jones, Newsweek, NPR, Smithsonian, Scientific American, Slate, The Atlantic, Nature, and The Guardian, among other publications. Welcome to the program, Maren. Please begin.
Thank you, Eric. And thanks, everyone, for being here. And welcome to today's program, which is titled Combating Antibiotic Resistance Globally, a conversation with Kevin Outterson, BU professor at the School of Law and executive director of CARB-X. Access to this event is being offered exclusively to members of BU's giving societies. And those of you on this call represent loyal, generous donors to BU, and this event has been organized to recognize your donation's impact and express gratitude for your support. So, Professor Kevin Outterson is a global thought leader on business models for antibiotic development and use. He is Professor of Law and the N. Neil Pike Scholar of Health and Disability Law at Boston University School of Law, where he leads multidisciplinary teams to solve global health issues. Professor Outterson is also the executive director and principal investigator of CARB-X and a partner in Drive AB. Professor Outterson is also the N. Neil Pike Scholar in Health and Disability Law at BU and an expert on pharmaceutical markets. So it's now my distinct pleasure to welcome Professor Outterson. Please begin.
Hello, everybody. I'm here today to give you an introduction to some of the issues that we face around the planet with antibiotic resistance, and to tell you a little bit about what we're doing about that at Boston University. And as Maren said, I lead CARB-X, which the CARB is not a diet. CARB stands for Combating Antibiotic-Resistant Bacteria. It was a program that was created under the Obama administration and is carried forward into the current administration. And at Boston University, we have the pleasure and the honor to lead a global project that is directly addressing this problem. So if you had to pick where at Boston University would you put this global partnership, I know what you're thinking. The first spot you put such a global partnership would be at the law school. This is a picture of the new law school building. If you're an alum from the school and remember the old building, it's been vastly improved as of late. But on the 12th floor of the law school, it's housed a small team of people whose job it is to select and allocate funds to entrepreneurial developers of innovative products, both new drugs, new vaccines against bacteria, new diagnostics, as well as some really amazing cutting-edge products. The reason why this is necessary is because we don't have enough antibiotics. This slide, a lot of the data is taken from both the WHO and from the Pew Charitable Trust. And some people might look at it and say, well, 42 antibiotics seems like a lot. There's two problems with that. First is, if you compare it to cancer drugs, there's over 1,000 immune oncology drugs in clinical development today. only 42 antibiotics. And secondly, most of those antibiotics aren't the type that are targeting the most dangerous pathogens. They're targeting things that are easier to get a drug approved, but not necessarily the things that keep the people at the CDC up and awake at night. And even if we were able to have perfect antibiotics, this is a problem. It's more like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. As soon as you started to this project, as soon as you finished it, you'd have to turn right around and go to the other end of the bridge and start painting again, because bacteria evolve. Whatever clever attack we have on them, whatever clever drug, they will eventually develop resistance to. It's not true in the same way for vaccines, which is an important reason why bacterial vaccines are part of what we do at CARB-X. So here's our first poll, and you heard the instructions. I want you to click A through F. There won't be a grade on what you pick, but the question is, how long has it been since we've had a new approved class of antibiotics that's been approved by the FDA? So I'm not talking about a discovery that's just in the lab, but one that makes it all the way through a pill that actually can help people. So we'll pause and click your answers. All right, I'm seeing C taking the lead there, 20 or 30 years. One last chance before I go on to the next slide and show you the answer. There's two main types of bacteria, gram-positives and gram-negatives. Gram-negatives, all that means is that the gram stain wouldn't detach. They wouldn't show up that way under a microscope. They have two cell walls. They're the more dangerous type. So for those of you who picked 30 to 40 years, you're correct for gram-positives. For those of you who picked 50 or more, that's the answer for gram-negatives. So to put this another way, the most dangerous bacteria that the scientists are worried about are those gram-negative bacteria. And how long has it been since we've had a new class that made it all the way to approval? It's been my entire life. It's been far too long. CARB-X is designed to try to make these numbers go down. We want to see new approvals of entirely novel classes. Now, we can't just pick one or two companies and hope that they're the ones that work out. If we get nothing from the slide, it's the fact that a lot of ideas start in the lab at places like Boston University and many other fine research universities around the world. And then they progress to small startup companies, and then typically they get bought up by larger companies or licensed at some point. But most of the projects don't make it all the way to FDA approval. It's not really a failure. It's just normal science. You know, when you try things with science, most of the time it doesn't work. You keep at it until you get through it. But the import here is that if you want one drug, you might need to be investing in 20 or 30 early topics, early projects, because otherwise you're not going to get what you really want at the end of the day. So CARB-X, we're not shooting to pick one or two winners. We're not that clever. Instead, we're going to invest in a portfolio of companies, as many as we can fund, and hopefully at the end of the day, we'll have some exciting, powerful, first-in-class products to help people. So this is a slide about how we work, and you know, I'd be a bad principal investigator if I didn't thank the people who so generously provided funds. As of today, CARB-X has up to $540 million US available over the first 5 years of our project. It's just north of $500 million US. And the largest funder is the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response within Department of Health and Human Services through its group called BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. They initiated this accelerator, CARB-X, with a $250 million request for proposals that different groups applied for, and our group at BU won that grant. The Wellcome Trust has committed up to $155.5 million US. It's 125 million pounds at the time. to CARB-X as well, the second largest funder. The NIAID, which is one of the arms of the NIH, provides very helpfully $50 million for the preclinical services to CARB-X companies, which enables them to do studies that they wouldn't be able to do otherwise. We're very proud to announce and to have on our roster here 2 additional partners who were not with us at the beginning, and that's the Government of the United Kingdom, represented here by the symbol UKAID, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We're in the late stages of completing the agreement with the government of Germany, who announced at the Grand Challenges meeting in Berlin some months ago that they were also joining CARB-X. So we take those funds, we take them through a rigorous science review process. We use not lawyers, thank goodness, but scientific experts from our funders and a lot of experts that worked commercially in antibiotic drug development over the past decades, many of which no longer work at large companies because many of the large companies have dropped out of this field. And they go through and do a rigorous process by which more than 100 applications are sifted down to less than 10 for my governance board, the funders, the Joint Oversight Committee, to select the ones that they want to fund. We administrate this program in cooperation with Boston University, like I said, from the 12th floor of the law school, but also with many helpful partners. You see some of them listed here. Wellcome Trust Services and Accelerator, RTI, which is the original tenant of the Research Triangle Park in North Carolina, is a very important partner with us. California Life Science is the group that represents and supports small biotech companies on the West Coast in San Francisco and San Diego and other parts of California. MassBio is a similar organization here in Boston. And the Broad Institute and also DITRA, which is the U.S. government agency that tests pathogens that have bioterrorism sort of potential. In other words, some drug that CARB-X companies might be working on might be intended to help against, a gram-negative infection in a hospital. It might also have the additional benefit of being useful as a defense in a bioterrorism sort of situation. So this is the basic structure of CARB-X. There's a lot going on, but our primary role is to create a system by which we can select with the most integrity we can the research projects to go forward, and then to support them with as many resources as possible. If you thought back a couple decades, a lot of these companies or a lot of these research projects would have been inside of a large pharmaceutical company. And today, most of the large companies are gone, and many of the companies that we support are quite small. They might have a veteran from a large company within it, but sometimes there are 10 or 20 full-time equivalent employees. Some are even smaller than that. And we find that they need sometimes additional support. They may be very strong in some areas, but not so strong in some other things that are required to get a drug all the way from the lab to the patient. And so we provide those services as well to the companies. So we provide the money. We also provide them with that sort of accelerator business, scientific, and technical support. As of now, and you can see this on our website too, in CARBX.org, we're funding projects today in 32 different projects in 6 countries. This number will substantially increase over this next year. We received over 400 applications last year. We're in the process of completing those now, and this number will go up significantly over the next few months. The key point I want to make here is that when we evaluate a project, what we want to know is how powerful is the science? How impactful would the program be to human health? And how good is the team of people that are around this project? Can they really execute? Those are the things we ask. We don't ask, where are they from? Which country or which part of the country or whatnot. We're agnostic in that sense to geography. We're looking for the best science wherever it's found, which I think is a tremendous advantage of the CARB-X system. You don't have to be from a given country in order to apply for funding from us. We pick the science where we see it. Now, heretofore, a lot of it has been in North America and Europe, but we are proud of our one company who successfully applied from India, and we try very hard to encourage other applications from around the world. I talked about some of this slide already, but just to emphasize, we go after antibiotics and other therapeutics, including things like phage-derived therapies, but also rapid diagnostics, because a lot of difficulties that we're having is because we're using antibiotics inappropriately. We're either giving the wrong antibiotic or sometimes many times giving antibiotics in situations where we really don't need to be giving an antibiotic. Better diagnostics would help to reduce unnecessary use and help to target the use of powerful antibiotics in the right setting. And then, as I said at the beginning, it's really important to think about the long-term goal here, and prevention and vaccines are tremendous. The best infection is the one that never happened. And so if we can prevent them, or either through microbiome approaches or monoclonal antibodies or through bacterial vaccines, all of that is good. When we need to know which bacteria to be concerned about, we look to the list generated for this purpose by the CDC and the World Health Organization. There's substantial overlap between the two, as you would expect. Now, when a company is selected by us, they're happy to receive money. CARB-X is nonprofit. We don't take a royalty. We don't take ownership. It's a grant. But we want to help these companies succeed because we want to see impact, positive impact on human health. And so we also provide accelerators, the accelerator network, and we have the logo here at the bottom. And I think before the end of this month, we should be announcing 6 or 7 additional accelerators joining CARB-X. I'm not in a position to put the names out yet, but look for this, look at the space, check our website. By the end of the month, it should be up. But what they're providing is all these other types of support, because we don't want a company or a project to fail because of lack of money. We also don't want it to fail because they made a business, technical, or science mistake that could have been avoided. So we're trying to help them out. We're looking for the whole ecosystem. We're trying to invest in a portfolio and raise the tide in a positive way for everybody, including the companies we don't fund. This is an important slide. Before I became director of CARB-X, I ran a research program just as a law professor at BU Law. And this represents, it's kind of sad to think about it, this represents many years of work between a whole host of people that have been thinking about these sorts of issues. And it took a while for this to come together, but it's powerful. So let's say that all you cared about was access to antibiotics. You wanted them to be free to everybody on the planet. That would ensure that people got antibiotics, but it would also destroy the ability of us to be careful with them. It would destroy conservation or stewardship. It also would make it hard for any company to make money on antibiotics if you're giving them out for free, so it undermines innovation. If you just focus on innovation, let's create all sorts of things like CARB-X to put new products into the pipeline, but you didn't care at all about access, about how people both in the United States and globally, whether the people who need them the most, whether they can afford them, whether they can get them. If you don't care about that, then it's unjust. And if you don't do it without thinking about conservation, without stewardship, without being careful not to waste them, then you're just, running the same sort of mistake that we made in past generations. We have to create new ones. We also have to be careful with the ones we create. And finally, if all you do is careful conservation, you put every antibiotic under lock and key, sure, they'll last longer, but they're not going to get to the people who need them. And it's also, companies can't make money on something that they're not allowed to sell. So you have to do all three of these things together. You have to focus on all of them together. And at CARB-X, we're mainly about innovation, but we have significant policies baked into our system, which addresses access and conservation, or access to stewardship, simultaneously. Because we know that to do one without the other two is ultimately a waste of our time. So here comes our second poll. What do you think? Finish your antibiotics early? Do you save them in the medicine cabinet or not? Please answer. I fear people have listened too carefully to the rest of this message. This is, I would encourage everyone to listen carefully to your doctor when you're in a prescription moment. There's a lot of evidence that patients push their doctors to prescribe an antibiotic even when the doctor is reluctant to do so. It does you no good to take an antibiotic if you have a viral infection. In fact, it does you a lot of harm. It's going to mess up your microbiome. Similarly, if the physician has told you to take that course for 5 or 10 days, whatever the prescription says, you should finish it. And the idea of taking an antibiotic that was prescribed for you and offering to somebody else for a couple of days if they get sick, these are exactly the sort of things which are common. It happens all the time. But it's clear that these types of practices drive resistance. It might harm you, it might harm your family. It certainly is going to harm the global effort to try to do something significant about antimicrobial resistance. So this is a summation slide. I think I've talked about most of the things on here. I could talk a little bit about the access and stewardship provisions. In CARB-X, when the companies receive funds from us, they make a promise. And the promise is essentially that they're going to work with us and our partners to ensure that the antibiotic, if it does make it all the way to approval at the FDA, or the European equivalent, or anywhere around the world for that matter, that they'll work with us and our partners to try to get access and stewardship as integral parts of that new drug product that goes out. In the last couple of minutes here, I wanted to say something about an ancillary program that with the support of President Brown, that we've been able to start at Boston University, really alongside CARB-X. This is a separate program, but it covers a similar topic, and this is called Social Innovation and Drug Resistance, or CIDR for short. And this is what got me thinking about CIDR. We have these amazing innovations called antibiotics, and yet when you give them to people, to humans and to human systems, they get misused, they get used in the wrong ways, they get overused and underused, and all sorts of negative things happen as a result. When you take great vaccines and you talk to people about them, sometimes people get scared of vaccines and decide their vaccines are dangerous, and that's the reason why we have outbreaks of things like measles, in the United States now, and not sufficient uptake on many other vaccines that were really helpful to human health. And for diagnostics, there's a number of companies with a really clever technology that if you understand what they do, that you would think this is a great diagnostic. It's a wonderful product. But when you try to implement that in the human systems of a hospital, with all the complexities of how hospitals are paid, both for diagnostics and paid for antibiotics, and all the relationships between the doctors who order tests and then how those tests are interpreted and how long it takes, it's clear that what we lack right now is not interesting technology, but a way to implement that technology so that it actually changes clinical practice. Because at the end of the day, we don't need a diagnostic that does great things in a lab. We need a diagnostic that helps people get better health care. And so CIDR is focused on all of these issues of really the social sciences of antibiotics. This is an area in which we know that antibiotics, are the whole problem of resistance is one that was created by humans. We've made it worse through the way that we treat and use antibiotics and whatnot. And so this effort here is designed to begin research programs in social science aspects of antibiotics. And like I said, the initial seed funding was generously from President Brown. We're hiring postdocs. There's, I think at last count, 13 or 14 BU professors who are involved, and we'll have 5 or 6 postdocs eventually through the program. It's housed not at the law school, but at the Institute for Health System Innovation and Policy, which is another part of the Boston University, and they provided amazing support for getting this off the ground in the past couple of months. And so with that, we will have plenty of time, I think, for some questions. Thank you for your attention, and be careful with antibiotics out there would be my closing word there. So, Maren, what questions do we have?
Thank you. We will now have our question and answer segment of the webcast. As a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, simply type your question into the chat box area located on the lower left corner of your screen. Once you have entered your question, click on the send button located next to the box. Your questions will not be viewable by any other attendees. So, Maren, please go ahead with our Q&A.
So we have such an active audience with so much response to those polls that I'm sure people are going to have a lot of questions. But while their questions are amassing into the queue, Kevin, let me ask you a couple. My first thought is, at this point, with the CARB-X having such a robust history for the past couple of years, you have spoken to a lot of antibiotic developers or potential developers. What's the single biggest deterrent to them actually achieving the drugs that they envision creating?
Without a doubt, it's not the science, it's the money. I want to say that the NIH and other funding organizations that fund basic science, NIAID in the United States and the equivalents in other countries, have done an amazing job funding university-based projects. And we've seen literally, hundreds of interesting antibiotic small companies that have spun out of universities and some of them homegrown research within companies. The science is really an encouraging part. We will have, based on our projections, by the end of this year, by the end of calendar year 19, 20 projects within CARB-X that each of them would be a new class against gram-negative antibiotics. So if just one of those succeeded, it's the most innovative thing in my lifetime for antibiotics. So the science is great. The problem has been the money. Antibiotics, the most innovative antibiotic, we want to put behind glass and not use it very much. And antibiotics have never been high-priced products. The most expensive antibiotic in the world is about $10,000 for a course of treatment, which saves a life. Compare that to a lot of cancer drugs, and it's really cheap. And so the problem is that the companies don't know how to make money in this field anymore, which is why all the big companies have left. They're very grateful for CARB-X. We are a lifeline to these companies in this late stages of translational research, all the way up to the end of the phase 1 human trials. But there's concern about what happens afterwards, whether there's any money to be made when they finally reach the market.
So that actually dovetails beautifully with a question that's been asked by a member of the audience, which is, if you, CARB-X, are taking care of that very risky early stage funding, what happens after that? Let's say that a set of developers successfully leverage your funds into a product that looks like it has potential and can go into trials. Where do they find the next tranche of money from?
Well, there's a couple of sources. Traditionally, the big companies would in-license or would buy a product that was ready for phase 2 trials. And so that would have been the historic answer, but the companies aren't there now because they aren't convinced that there's money to be made. In terms of charitable money or government money, the U.S. government, the agency that leads our funding, BARDA, has been for many years now the largest funder, either in the U.S. or the world, depending how you count, of antibacterial phase 2 and phase 3 trials. And a counterpart in Europe, funded by the Innovative Medicines Initiative, also part of the European Commission, does a similar sort of types of projects in Europe. But it's not clear at all that those funds are sufficient. In fact, I'd say it more strongly. There's not enough money to advance all the way to approval the types of drugs that we're seeing coming through the CARB-X portfolio. We need more funds for that purpose. And even upon approval, you know, for most companies, getting that stamp of approval by the FDA is like you pop the champagne cork and have a party. For antibiotics, sometimes, or even for most of the last companies that have had an approval, it's been quite a disappointing event because the sales after approval are so thin. This is a great idea for public health. We don't want to abuse these new antibiotics. We do want to save them, but we need to figure out another way to reward these companies. Otherwise, you know, they'll move on to something else.
So that's depressing. So let's dial back to a more cheerful moment in the process, which is the moment at which developers hear from you that CARB-X is going to send them some funding. A member of the audience has a sort of multi-part question about this, which is, first, your screening committee members who are helping you to review applications, how do you choose them? How do you take into account whatever biases are inherent in their countries of origin or the work they've otherwise done? And then sort of part two of that question is, once you decide to make a grant, what is the process that the milestones that the person you've made the award to or the company you've made the award to or group that they have to meet in order to assure you that they were a good selection and they're doing what you funded them to do?
Right. So I just want to have everyone feel comfortable with the fact that lawyers are not picking the companies. You know, if lawyers are good at something, it's creating process and following the rules. And so part of your question on the scientific advisory board was how do we clear them from conflicts? And we have just an outstanding system for reviewing and adjudicating any sort of conflicts of interest with our advisors, with the companies that we're dealing with. They have to disclose all of their financial ties, their consulting ties, everything. And then we have an external monitor who's not at Boston University who screens that and basically keeps us as unconflicted as possible. But I'll say it this other way. You asked where the people come from. A good number of them are scientific experts from NIH and from some of our other funders, from BARDA and other technical academic experts. And then a number of them are former antibiotic drug developers who used to work at the large companies before the large companies exited the field. And in the final rounds of our process, we have generally 10 to 12 of these experts in a room. If the topic that day is vaccines, and these are going to be vaccines experts, if it's microbiome, we'll focus on that. If it's diagnostics, you know, we'll set the room based on the topic that's coming in that day. But they come physically to Boston, and the companies who are finalists fly to Boston. They present live in front of this group, and have to stand for what many of them say, many of the companies say, is the most scientifically detailed, laser-focused question and answer that they ever have to stand for. And then they leave the room, and the group discusses and argues for 30 minutes and then makes a recommendation onto the funders. It's an amazing process. I'm really proud of the robust discussion that happens, and also the fact that CARB-X is willing to take risk. We don't want to just, take the things that are 12-0, everyone approves. We also want to look at the things that a few people were uncomfortable with, but we still think that the risk and the reward, the reward is high enough that the risk is worth taking.
So let me prompt you to the second part. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, the second question is about milestones. And we don't give them a check for the whole, $2 or $3 or $5 million up front. They send us invoices every month, and we pay them based on the budget that we've negotiated with them. And if it's after a year or a year and a half, we've built into the budget, built into the system, milestones that they'll have to have met that are generally scientific, but occasionally business and financial. So a scientific milestone will say you're going to run a series of animal tests. We want to see a certain type of result before we'll pay for the next round to take the project up to the next level. For a project that comes to us in a very early stage, there might be two milestones, two different milestone moments in which a significant number of technical things have to be met. That's reviewed again by members of our Science Advisory Board. It's a formal process, and if the decision is yes to go forward, that again goes back to my board for approval to fund. So we're serious in the same way that venture capital or private investors would be about milestones. We make both positive and negative decisions at that milestone review. We've had a number of projects that didn't meet the numbers, and we said thank you, but we're not choosing to exercise the option to fund you going forward. And that's not failure, that's just science, and we want to encourage those companies, and maybe they'll come back with something better later, but we're going to focus our funding on things that continue to meet those milestones and move forward.
So a couple of the audience members have asked questions that I'm going to sort of knit together here that have to do with what happens after the potential products that you're funding the early research for kind of leave from under the CARB-X roof. One audience member would like to know if a product is successfully achieved, gets all the way through development, how can adoption of that product be guaranteed? And a second sort of related question is, if new products are successful, whether it's an antibiotic or a diagnostic, how can they be put into the market in a way that maintains the integrity of all the sides of that triad that you discussed?
Well, currently there's no one who does that, right? So the companies, some companies will try to do their very best, but they're just a single company involved in a market. We're going to have a portfolio of companies. By the end of this year, we'll have 50. Today, we have 32. And by the time CARB-X is done, whether it's at the end of the first 5 years or more likely this 5 years should be renewed for another 5, there's literally going to be dozens upon dozens, an unknown number of companies that have come through the CARB-X system and graduate. So we're trying to change how every company thinks about this. So every company is introduced to thinking about access and stewardship. We work with them. When they graduate, their obligations don't cease to us on access and stewardship. If the proposal is successful, if the drug keeps going forward, they'll continue to work with us and with our partners like the Wellcome Trust, who is the world's second largest funder of biomedical research, second only to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in terms of private funders of biomedical research. And they're very interested in helping this process go forward, as are the governments that support CARB-X. So, you know, I don't have an answer. You can evaluate how we're doing in a decade, because that's how long it'll take for one of our projects to actually get approved. But we have in place really good global health leadership at institutional levels that care deeply about this problem and will have a central role in helping to move it forward.
So because we're talking about stewardship, I have to ask the following question, because several audience members have sent it in. I think it may again not be under CARB-X's roof, but I'm sure they're interested in your opinion, which is, how can you influence the triad, I guess, of antibiotic development and antibiotic use outside of medicine, particularly in agriculture and the environment? Is there any, do you have an opinion on that? Do you have any thoughts to offer about controlling those uses?
Yeah, I think the chances are low that anybody with the intellectual property, with the patent to a new class against a new class of antibiotics useful in humans would license those anymore into animal uses. You know, that was a traditional strategy many years ago. And some of the other antibiotics used in animal agriculture and non-animal agriculture today were antibiotics that didn't work out for humans. You know, it fell out of the human development program and it went over to the animal side instead. So I think the key will be finding ways to adequately reward the companies for what they've done in terms of bringing an amazing product to market, without leaving them with the terrible temptation of overutilizing it in unnecessary ways. So the animals need antibiotics too. There should be more research and development for classes that work, you know, in the species that need them most. But we shouldn't be put in a situation in which things that are important to global human health are wasted in other capacities.
Mm-hmm. A subject close to my heart. So we've talked a number of times in this conversation about the role of the government, ways in which the government is assisting with this process and not. What's going on right now, given that a good portion of the U.S. government is shut down? Is that affecting CARB-X's process or the things that developers need to be doing at this point?
You know, we are not a government agency. We're trustees of Boston University, so CARB-X is 100% functioning. A lot of our funding comes from Health and Human Services, which, you know, just due to the way things happened, had appropriations before the shutdown for the most part. There's a couple of parts within HHS that lack funding, but none that directly touch CARB-X. But more broadly, there's some elements of CDC that I think you know, don't have money. I think Indian Health Service is one. And in the FDA, the commissioner has been tweeting about you know, how many things are not functional right now at FDA. He's restarted the high-risk food safety surveillance program and inspections using unpaid volunteers. And, you know, people who, just like when I got on the plane yesterday at Boston Logan, I asked the person checking my passport after she was done whether she was on furlough and not being paid. She said, yes, none of us are being paid. So it's astonishing what people, you know, the service that they're rendering right now, and without having a paycheck now for almost a month. But there are parts within the FDA that will increasingly have strain, and are strained today and will be strained even more over the coming weeks. But they don't directly affect us yet. Long term, though, there's a lot of things that CDC and HHS, other parts of HHS do, that are just behind the scenes. They collect data, they do surveillance, they sponsor scientific work on trying to track new outbreaks. None of that is, you know, front page news, but it's exactly the sort of hardcore science that we need to have continue to go forward. And in order to know who the enemy is. It's like you wouldn't go into battle with all of your soldiers blindfolded. The agencies that are on the front line of this battle, need to have their tools.
So let's all hope that the government comes back soon, that Congress and the White House reach an agreement, and we have full functioning at all the federal health agencies again. Is there anything looking forward that you would like to see the federal health agencies, particularly I suppose the FDA, be doing differently around antibiotic development and approval and associated approvals like diagnostics? Are there things about speed of approvals or trial structure or anything that you're picking up that is dissatisfying to drug developers?
So I think this is the one area in which if you asked 50 drug developers how the FDA is doing, I think almost all of them would say the FDA is really doing a great job. And I know that drug developers love to complain about the FDA in some other categories, but in this area, the folks that lead this at USFDA, I think the industry understands they're doing a wonderful job. Do you remember earlier that I said something about how hard the market was, and you said that's really depressing? That's the thing I would go and fix. If I was able to wave a wand and get governments to do something, I would design a way to pay antibiotic developers companies for the wonderful, powerful social value of these antibiotics in a way that was completely not linked to how many pills they sell. This is one product that we want to pay people today really for generations of value, not what it's going to be used for tomorrow. That's called in the policy lingo, delinkage or a pull incentive or a market entry reward. But these are ideas of ways to pay for antibiotic innovation based on how valuable it is for society, not based on the volume of pills that are put into patients.
So I just forced you to talk about what possibly the government could do differently, but most of the people on this call probably are not members of the government. So is there anything you can say to the audience about, is there any role in this complicated conversation about getting more and better antibiotics where individual action makes a difference? Is there anything that people on this call can do to help?
The CDC puts out a scary chart every year of how many antibiotics people are taking by state. And if you looked at the states, in Appalachia, like West Virginia, and you compared them to some places like California, you'd find, twice as many antibiotics being taken in certain parts of the country than they are in California. And so it raises the question, are people dying of antibiotic, bacteria, resistant bacteria in California, or are they pretty healthy? It's probably true that the difference represents not a mistake, too little antibiotics in California. It might be people taking too many antibiotics in other parts of the country, and it's really not just one region. If you looked on the map, there's a lot of states that fall into that. The CDC estimates that more than half of the antibiotics that are taken by people probably are inappropriate in the United States. That they're being taken for a condition that would resolve on its own if you waited another day or two, or that were never bacterial to begin with, were viral. And so if we wanted to eliminate, half of the problem with generating resistance, it would be just everybody not pushing their doctor to get an antibiotic when the physician really thinks they can wait.
So thinking a bit more about who's on this call, we've actually gotten a question from the audience about what is the submission process to CARB-X? I think we're going to have to assume that some developers dialed in at the last minute. So assume that in your audience is someone who actually is a developer and wants to approach CARB-X for a grant. What should they do next, and where do they find that information?
So it's on our website, CARBX.org, and it shouldn't be hard to find. We'll open rounds. We don't have any open rounds today because we're digesting those 400 applications we received last year. But, you know, in short order, we'll be announcing the rounds that we'll have open for 2019. And there will be, you know, multiple rounds that will be open in 2019. And on the website, we'll put the dates that they open and what the topics are. So it might say, you know, diagnostics, you know, the application date is this week, you know, in a certain month. And for vaccines, you know, here's the dates. And that will all be available on the website when we've made a final decision on the 2019 rounds. You apply during that week that it's open. And our initial application is called Expression of Interest. We designed it to be non-confidential. We don't want to know anything that's business confidential at that point. And it's designed to be the sort of thing that could be filled out by the scientific lead of a company in about an hour. You know, we didn't want hundreds of companies spending, you know, weeks creating this thing. We wanted the first application to be relatively simple. The next middle round of applications it's about a 10-page application. The final application is quite serious. It's 50 pages, plus you come and stand up live, you know, in front of our ad board and answer questions. So we weight most of the work towards the latter stages of the program when your chances of success as a developer are higher.
So we're coming up on the top of the hour. And I'm going to close the call in a moment or two. But before we do, I wonder, Kevin, if there's any kind of final statement you'd like to make about CARB-X, about the urgency of the project you've undertaken, about what you'd most like people to take away from this encounter today.
The history of the antibiotic era, you know, since we've had antibiotics in medicine, it's a tremendous thing. It's probably the most important, most impactful class of drugs in human history. It would be hard-pressed to point to another one right now in terms of the total number of lives saved. And unlike most of these other drugs, you have to maintain it. You know, you have to take care of it. It goes away if you ignore it because of the way the bacteria evolve and respond and mutate over time. And so we love what the antibiotic era has given us, the ability to do things like hip implants or cancer treatment, you know, which depresses your immune system and would make you susceptible to infections, but for antibiotics. Cesarean sections and common things that are done in the hospital, all of them would be much more dangerous without antibiotics. So I think it's something that most of us take for granted, and we think of them as inexpensive and always available and easy to get. And the goal of CARB-X is so that the world does not change radically. We don't want you know, our kids or grandchildren to be living in a post-antibiotic era. So we're trying to get new classes, new vaccines, new devices teed up and ready to go so that things don't have to change dramatically. It's kind of an anti-revolution than that.
The idea of a post-antibiotic era and all the ways that society would change if we lost antibiotics is profoundly terrifying to me. As you say, everything from the loss of major surgery to the loss of minor things we take for granted. To me, more than anything, it's the loss of just sort of a casual comfort with which we live our lives now, a comfort that our grandparents and great-grandparents didn't have because they didn't have the protection of antibiotics, that we would go back to the terror they felt at any infection, at any scratch, at the advance of any dirt is a profoundly disturbing thing. And we'll hope that the work that CARB-X is doing in identifying worthy developers is going to hold that era off as long as possible. So thank you so much for sharing. Go ahead.
I was going to say, when you read Jane Austen, people are always writing letters to each other, and the first thing they ask is how everyone's doing. If anyone's sick or about to die. And everyone's, eager to get on a horse or a carriage and ride off if somebody's sick, because they know that if they wait a day, mom or their sister or their spouse could be dead.
Yeah.
And it's just we don't even, when we read books like that from prior centuries, we can miss just how prevalent and how quick death came by infection. So
we have mostly forgotten that the very first human to receive penicillin experimentally, Police Constable Albert Alexander in the UK, was so desperately sick that he needed this experimental drug because what he had done was walked into his garden and scratched his face on a rose bush, and that rose bush infection eventually killed him. We will hope we will never be back there again. So now, I really must end the program. Thank you for sharing your insight with us to this complex world of antibiotic development, the pharmaceutical industry, and this profound need to develop new antibiotics for these superbugs that menace us. And we'll trust that the research that CARB-X is supporting is going to bring us further along the path of always having new antibiotics. And audience, thank you so much for being here today. We're about to conclude the webcast, but first, it's my job and my honor to thank you for your participation and for all that you do to support Boston University. The university is grateful for that support. You'll receive an email after we all disconnect with a link to a brief survey about this webinar. We hope that you'll fill it out. Your feedback matters a great deal, not just to this program, but also to the conduct of further webinars. I need to remind you that today's program is copyrighted in 2019 by BU, and all of its rights are reserved. And with that, we thank you again, and you can disconnect now.